They say a new house is a fresh start, a place where memories are made, families grow, and peace finally settles in. But what if the walls of your new home aren't as empty as they seem? What if every creak, every shadow, every whisper isn't the house settling, but something that has been waiting long before you ever moved in? Tonight I'll share with you 3 disturbing TRU new house horror stories that prove sometimes moving into your dream home can quickly turn into your worst nightmare. The family had been waiting for months to finally move into their new home. After years of renting cramped apartments and dealing with noisy neighbors, they believed they had finally found a place where they could settle down and start fresh. The house itself was old but charming, with tall windows that let in golden sunlight and hardwood floors that creaked softly underfoot. To them, the creaks only added character, a reminder of history within those walls. On the first day, excitement buzzed in the air as they unpacked boxes, laughed at the mess of tangled wires and misplaced items, and dreamed of all the happy memories they would soon create. It felt like a fresh chapter, as though life had finally given them a gift they deserved. The first few nights were uneventful, filled with exhaustion from carrying heavy boxes and rearranging furniture. Sleep came easily, but as the week progressed, subtle changes began to surface. Late at night, when the house was wrapped in silence, faint footsteps echoed in the hallways. At first, they brushed it off as the house adjusting to the change of new occupants. Perhaps the wood expanding or the wind pressing against the frame. Yet, there was something unsettling about the rhythm of those sounds. They were not random creaks or groans of an old structure. They were measured, deliberate, as though someone was walking slowly, back and forth just outside their bedroom doors. The father was the first to notice. He often stayed up late working in his home office, and more than once, he heard the sound of someone pacing the corridor. Thinking it was one of the children sneaking around, he would step out, only to find the hallway empty. The lights would flicker softly as if struggling against an unseen force, and the air felt unusually cold despite the summer heat. He told himself it was just his imagination, a mix of fatigue and the eeriness of being in a house not yet fully lived in. But unease had begun to settle in his mind, a seed that would grow with each passing night. One evening, the mother was putting away laundry in one of the upstairs rooms when she heard the front door slam shut downstairs. Startled, she called out for her husband, only to hear his voice replying from behind her. He had been in the room the entire time. They rushed downstairs, only to find the door firmly locked, exactly as they had left it. The sound had been so clear, so distinct, it was impossible to dismiss. The children, too, began to complain about odd occurrences. Their youngest daughter said someone knocked on her bedroom door late at night, but when she opened it, no one was there. Their son, too old to be scared by shadows, admitted he often woke to the sensation of someone standing near his bed watching. As days turned into weeks, the family's initial joy of moving in was overshadowed by an invisible weight pressing down on them. Every corner of the house seemed to hum with unseen energy. Mirrors reflected movements that did not exist, and doors that were shut firmly before bed were found wide open by morning. Yet, the footsteps remained the most disturbing. Always at night, always steady, as though reminding them that the house they had claimed as their own was not empty, and perhaps had never been. The uneasiness that had begun to spread through the family only deepened as they tried to adjust to their new life in the house. The footsteps that haunted the hallways were no longer isolated incidents. Now, even in the middle of the day, faint noises lingered in the corners of rooms where no one was standing. The mother tried to ignore them while cleaning or cooking, but the subtle shuffling, just beyond her hearing range, kept her on edge. At night, however, the atmosphere changed entirely. The silence of the house became oppressive, as though the walls themselves were listening. It was during these quiet hours that the family began to notice something else. Whispers, soft and disjointed, seeping through the walls. At first, they thought it might be neighbors. The houses in the neighborhood were close together, and sound sometimes carried through thin spaces. But these whispers were different. They weren't coming from outside, but from within the very structure of their home. The father would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, convinced he could hear voices bleeding through the plaster. The sounds were faint, like overlapping murmurs, too soft to make out words, but persistent enough to chill the blood. He would press his ear to the wall, certain he would catch a phrase, but it always dissolved into a strange static, like breath without form. The children noticed it too. Their daughter asked her mother one morning why people were talking in her room when she was trying to sleep. The mother asked what she meant, and the child explained that she could hear voices inside the walls, whispering so close it felt like they were standing right behind her bed. Their son, who tried to act braver than he felt, confessed one evening that the whispers weren't just random. Sometimes they called his name. He had heard it more than once, a soft, drawn-out version of his name carried on a voice that didn't belong to anyone in the family. Sleep became scarce. Nights were restless, with the family waking repeatedly to the sound of whispers weaving in and out of the silence. The house seemed to breathe around them, its wooden frame creaking and sighing as though alive, and the voices never stopped. The mother began leaving lights on in the hallway, hoping brightness would drive away whatever was happening. But the whispers only seemed louder in the glow of artificial light, as if mocking their attempts at comfort. The father grew irritable and withdrawn, his exhaustion visible in his hollow eyes. He would spend long hours staring at the walls, lost in thought, as though trying to decipher the words being spoken just beyond reach. One particularly dark night, the whispers escalated. The daughter screamed from her bedroom, waking the entire family. When they rushed in, they found her trembling under the covers, insisting that the walls had been speaking clearly to her. She couldn't repeat everything, but she swore she had heard a phrase that chilled her to her core. "You don't belong here." Her brother admitted that he had heard the same thing in his room days earlier, but had been too afraid to tell anyone. The parents stood in the dim light, both shaken by the realization that whatever haunted their home wasn't just aimless energy. It was aware of them. It was speaking directly to them. From that night on, the whispers were no longer background noise. They grew sharper, louder, more insistent. Sometimes they rose in unison, like a crowd of voices speaking all at once, echoing through the thin walls of every room. The family would huddle together, pretending to watch television or talk over dinner, but the voices were always there, surrounding them, impossible to ignore. The house, which once promised them peace and a fresh start, had turned into something far darker, and the walls no longer felt like barriers of protection, but instead like living skin, holding secrets and resentments that were waiting to be unleashed. The whispers had already started to tear at the family's nerves, leaving them drained and uneasy, but soon something far more unsettling began to manifest. It was no longer only about sounds in the night, or the sense of being overheard by unseen presences. Now the family was confronted with something they could see. The first time it happened, the son was walking down the hallway late at night to grab a glass of water. He paused halfway, his heart freezing when he caught sight of a shadow moving across the wall. It was tall, elongated, and seemed to glide as though it had its own purpose, but when he turned to see who it was, the hallway was empty. He stood there in silence, forcing himself to believe it was nothing, but the cold air pressing down on him made it impossible to ignore the growing sense that he was not alone. When he told his parents the next morning, they tried to brush it aside, reminding him that shadows could play tricks, especially with the dim lighting and his tired eyes. But soon the others began to notice the same thing. The daughter screamed one evening when she saw a figure standing near her bedroom window. Her parents rushed inside, but there was nothing there, only the faint sway of the curtain, as though someone had just moved it aside. She insisted that it wasn't her imagination. The figure had been clear, a dark outline that stood motionless, watching her with an intensity she could feel even without eyes to meet. The parents grew alarmed when their own experiences began. The mother was folding clothes in the living room when she noticed movement reflected in the television screen. She froze, staring at the reflection of a shadow passing directly behind her, though the room itself was empty when she turned. The father, though skeptical of anything he couldn't explain, admitted late one night that he had seen someone standing at the end of the hall. He had thought it was his son at first, until the figure melted into the darkness right before his eyes. These shadows were not random shapes cast by light. They moved with intent, appearing in corners, lingering at doorways, and slipping away whenever someone dared to look directly at them. The sightings became more frequent, and with each new encounter, the atmosphere of the house grew heavier. The children refused to sleep alone anymore, dragging their blankets to their parents' room in the middle of the night. Even then, they claimed they saw shapes lurking in the corners or standing silently near the doorway. The mother felt her nerves fraying, unable to shield her children from something she couldn't understand or fight against. The father grew quieter, his usual calm demeanor giving way to tension as though he was constantly bracing for something he couldn't predict. One night, While the family sat together in the living room trying to distract themselves with television, the power suddenly cut out. Darkness swallowed the house, thick and suffocating. At first, there was silence, only the sound of their own breathing. Then, slowly shadows began to emerge in the faint sliver of moonlight spilling through the window. Figures stretched along the walls, bending unnaturally, moving even though nothing else in the room stirred. The daughter clutched her mother's arm, whispering that they were all around them. The father stood, his voice trembling as he tried to reassure the family. But his words faltered when one of the shadows detached itself from the wall and slid across the floor toward them. The lights flickered back to life, just as suddenly as they had gone out, and everything looked normal again, but the damage was already done. The family no longer felt safe in their own home. The whispers had warned them, but the shadows had shown them the truth. Whatever lived within those walls was not content with being unseen any longer. It had made itself known, and it was only the beginning of what was to come. The family had reached a point where every night felt like a battle they were destined to lose. The footsteps had unsettled them, the whispers had shaken their nerves, and the shadows had stripped away any remaining sense of safety. By the time the fourth chapter of their ordeal began, sleep was nearly impossible. They huddled together in the master bedroom more often than not, all four of them sharing the same restless space as though proximity could protect them. Yet even then, the house seemed determined to remind them that it wasn't theirs. Strange knocks echoed on the walls, always in threes, as if some unseen hand was demanding their attention. The air grew so cold at night that they could see their breath in the darkness, though no window was open and the heating system worked just fine. The mother tried to keep the family calm by convincing herself and everyone else that it was stress, exhaustion, maybe even paranoia building from the chaos of moving into an unfamiliar house. But deep down she knew something more sinister was happening, especially after the night she found handprints smeared across the foggy bathroom mirror. She had just stepped out of the shower when she noticed them. Small, childlike prints that weren't hers or her daughter's. The thought that another presence had touched the glass sent her stumbling back in fear. She called her husband into the room, but by the time he arrived, the mirror had cleared, leaving nothing but her horrified reflection staring back. The father, though desperate to stay logical, was beginning to lose his grip. He would sit up late at night, clutching a baseball bat, his eyes darting to every corner of the room at the slightest movement. He admitted quietly to his wife that he felt watched constantly, not just during the night, but in broad daylight as well. The sensation followed him everywhere, from the kitchen to the backyard, as though invisible eyes were fixed on him no matter where he stood. The children sensed his unease and clung even tighter to their mother, whispering their fears in hushed voices they didn't want their father to hear. One night, while the family lay awake in the master bedroom, a sound unlike anything they had heard before rose from the basement. It started as a low rumble, a deep vibration that rattled the floorboards beneath their feet. Then came the dragging, a heavy scrape as though something massive was being pulled across the concrete. The father, against every instinct, decided to investigate. Armed with his bat and a flashlight, he crept downstairs while his family begged him not to. The beam of light shook in his hands as he reached the basement door, each step down the stairs creaking under his weight. When he reached the bottom, the sound abruptly stopped. The basement was empty, cold and silent, but the air carried a suffocating weight, pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. He backed away slowly, his instincts screaming at him to leave. That night marked a turning point. The family could no longer deny that something was feeding off their fear. The house was no longer just a place to live. It was alive, awake, and aware of them. The children refused to sleep at all, jolting awake from nightmares where dark figures stood over their beds. The mother found herself praying aloud in desperation, clinging to the hope that faith might drive whatever it was away. The father, though proud and protective, began researching the history of the house late into the night, hoping to uncover something that would explain why their dream home had turned into a place of terror. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that they weren't the first family to suffer here, and likely they would not be the last. The father's late night research soon became an obsession. He pored over old records, newspaper clippings, and property documents, desperate to uncover why the house felt so wrong. What he discovered only deepened his fear. The land their home was built on had a history steeped in tragedy. Decades ago, the property had belonged to a reclusive man whose sudden disappearance was never explained. Years later, another family moved in, only to leave abruptly after claiming the house was cursed. Neighbors whispered about screams in the night, objects moving on their own, and figures seen in the windows long after the place had been abandoned. The father didn't share all the details with his wife and children, but he couldn't hide the growing dread in his eyes. He now understood that their experiences were not new. Something had always been in that house, something that clung to it and refused to let go. Meanwhile, the activity inside their home grew increasingly violent. It was no longer limited to whispers, shadows, and footsteps. Objects began to move without explanation. Doors slammed so hard they shook the walls. Plates rattled in the cabinets even when no one was near. One afternoon, the mother found every chair in the dining room, stacked neatly on top of the table, something she knew she hadn't done. Fear turned to panic when the children began to bear the brunt of the disturbances. The daughter screamed after her dolls were thrown across her room with unseen force. The son complained of scratches on his arms that appeared while he was asleep, thin red lines etched into his skin like warnings carved by invisible hands. The family tried to resist the mounting terror, clinging to routines and pretending things were normal, but it was impossible to ignore what was happening. Sleep deprivation took its toll, leaving them exhausted and irritable. Shadows moved freely in plain sight now, slipping down hallways and disappearing into walls as though mocking their fear. The whispers had grown bolder too. They no longer murmured in soft tones but rose into angry hisses, words breaking through the static with alarming clarity. One night, both children swore they heard the same phrase at the exact same time. "Get out." The father, who once tried to stand as the pillar of strength, began to unravel under the weight of it all. His frustration boiled into anger as he shouted into the empty rooms, demanding the presence reveal itself. His wife tried to calm him, but the damage was done. The very night he taunted the unseen forces, the house retaliated. While they slept, every door in the house swung open at once, slamming against the walls with a deafening crash. Lights flickered violently, and the sound of heavy footsteps raced through the upstairs hallway. The family huddled together in the living room, the air charged with an energy that felt like a storm trapped within the walls. When morning finally came, none of them spoke about what had happened, but the unspoken truth was clear. They were trapped in a place that didn't want them there. The mother suggested leaving, even just for a few nights, but the father shook his head, insisting they couldn't run. He told himself it was their home, that they had a right to live there, but deep down he feared it was already too late. The house had sunk its grip into them, and leaving wouldn't be as simple as walking away. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper reminded them that whatever had claimed the house was only growing stronger, feeding off their fear, and preparing for something far worse. The tension inside the house had reached a point where every breath felt heavy, every corner seemed to conceal something waiting, and every silence was a trap that pressed on their nerves. By the time the 6th chapter of their torment unfolded, the family had already accepted that they were no longer in control of their home, yet they remained frozen, caught between fear of staying and fear of what might follow them if they tried to leave. It was during this fragile state that the presence in the house began to show itself in ways that could no longer be dismissed as tricks of light or imagination. Apparitions began to appear, fleeting at first, but growing bolder with each passing day. The daughter was the first to see it clearly. She woke in the middle of the night and found a figure standing in the corner of her room. It was not a shadow this time, but something more solid, a shape that seemed human but wrong in its stillness. She could not see its face, only the outline of a body draped in darkness that seemed to breathe with her. Frozen in terror, she could not scream until it tilted its head as though acknowledging her. The sound that tore from her throat woke the entire house, and when her parents rushed in, the corner was empty, though the coldness in the air made them believe her story without question. Soon after, the son claimed he saw the same figure at the end of the hallway. He described it as taller than a man, its body unnaturally thin, its arms too long as though they stretched past what should have been possible. He swore it had been standing there in silence, watching him before slipping into the wall, as though it had been absorbed by the house itself. His words shook his parents, who tried to reassure him, but could not deny that they too had begun catching glimpses of the figure in their peripheral vision, always gone when they turned their heads. The apparitions grew stronger, more intrusive. Mirrors reflected things that weren't there, faces looming behind them, eyes watching from the glass. The mother nearly collapsed one evening when she saw her reflection smile back at her even though she hadn't moved her lips. Objects no longer shifted subtly, they flew across rooms, shattering against walls. Doors slammed without warning, shaking the frame so violently that cracks began to spread in the paint. The house seemed to pulse with an energy that left them dizzy and weak, as if the very air had been poisoned. The worst came one night when the family tried to gather in the living room for comfort. The father, attempting to remain strong, told them they had to stand their ground, that showing fear only gave power to whatever haunted them. But as he spoke, the lights dimmed until only the glow of the television illuminated the room. The temperature dropped in an instant, their breaths turning to mist, and then the figure appeared, not in a shadow, not in a reflection, but standing fully in the doorway. Its body seemed to waver, as though it were made of smoke bound into human form, yet its presence was undeniable. The children clung to their mother, their sobs muffled against her chest, while the father stood frozen, his words failing him as the figure began to move forward. It didn't walk so much as glide, each step silent yet deliberate, its faceless head turning as if to study each of them. The oppressive energy filled the room, pressing against their chests and choking their lungs. Just when it seemed the figure would reach them, the lights flickered violently and the apparition dissolved into nothing, leaving only the echo of its presence behind. The silence afterward was unbearable. They did not speak, did not move, barely dared to breathe, for they all understood the truth in that moment. The presence in their house was no longer content with whispers or shadows. It had revealed itself, and it was growing stronger with every encounter, feeding on their fear and drawing closer each night. The family had crossed a threshold where the haunting was no longer something they could push aside or rationalize. Each night became a trial of endurance, and each day brought with it a lingering dread that never left their minds. The figure that had revealed itself in the doorway continued to return, sometimes in fleeting glimpses and other times in full form, as if it were testing its hold over the family. They began to lose track of time, as sleep came in broken fragments and daylight offered no comfort. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a rhythm of dread that followed them from room to room. The daughter grew increasingly withdrawn, rarely speaking and spending much of her time staring blankly at walls, as though listening to something only she could hear. When asked, she whispered that the voices were louder now, and that they spoke to her directly. She said they told her secrets about the house, about how it had claimed others before them, and how it was waiting to take them too. Her words unsettled her parents to the core, but the fear in her eyes proved she wasn't inventing stories. At night she would wake screaming, her small hands clawing at the air as if she were fighting off unseen hands. The son became restless and angry, lashing out in ways uncharacteristic of him. He accused his parents of bringing them to a cursed place, of ignoring the warnings that were now carved into every moment of their lives. He confessed to hearing his name whispered constantly, not only at night but in the middle of the day, sometimes so close it felt like hot breath on his ear. His moods shifted quickly from rage to despair, as if whatever lived in the house was feeding on him the most, draining his strength and planting its influence deeper within him. The mother found herself spiraling into hopelessness. She tried to keep the family together, cooking meals they barely touched, forcing smiles that faltered the moment her children looked away. But in private she was plagued with experiences she didn't dare share. She woke to the sound of someone breathing directly above her face, only to find nothing there. She felt hands gripping her ankles as she walked down the stairs, sending her tumbling once when the grasp was too strong. In the bathroom, she caught sight of her own reflection, turning its head a fraction slower than she had, its eyes lingering with a malice that wasn't hers. She prayed constantly, clutching a rosary her mother had given her, but the prayers seemed to do little more than enrage whatever lingered in the house. The father was deteriorating the fastest. Once the calm and logical protector of his family, he now looked like a shadow of himself. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt, and his hands shook as though he were constantly bracing for impact. He confessed to his wife that he had begun hearing his own name at night, whispered in a voice that sounded eerily like hers. He admitted he no longer trusted his senses, that sometimes when he looked at his children, their faces blurred, replaced by something pale and monstrous that faded as quickly as it appeared. He became obsessed with trying to confront the entity, sitting awake in the dark with nothing but a flashlight, daring it to show itself again. The house seemed to respond to this growing tension by escalating its torment. Walls groaned as though the house itself was alive, floors buckled under invisible weight, and lights either exploded in bursts of sparks or stayed on all night, humming with unnatural energy. One night, all the picture frames in the hallway fell to the ground at the same time, shattering into jagged glass that glittered like teeth on the floor. Another night, a deafening bang shook the walls, as though something enormous had slammed into the house from the outside, though nothing could be found when the father rushed out to look. By now, the family no longer questioned whether they were being haunted. The only question left was how much longer they could endure, before whatever had claimed the house finally claimed them too. The 8th chapter of their ordeal began with the fragile hope that maybe they could find help, that someone outside their family could bring relief from the torment that had consumed their lives. The mother had reached a point where she could no longer watch her children waste away under the weight of fear. She contacted a local priest, an old man known for blessing troubled homes, though she carefully avoided telling him every detail for fear he would think her insane. When he arrived, the house seemed to react almost instantly. The air grew thick, heavy enough to make each breath feel strained, and the walls popped and cracked as though resisting his presence. The priest moved from room to room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers, his voice steady even as the family clung to each other. For a brief moment, there was silence, a stillness that felt almost like the house itself was holding its breath. But then came a sound so loud it seemed to shake the foundation, an enraged scream, high and piercing, echoing from the walls themselves. The priest faltered, gripping his rosary tighter, and his face revealed what the family had dreaded all along. This was not something easily pushed away. The priest completed his blessing, sweat dripping down his brow, and told them that the house was troubled by something that had claimed it long before they arrived. His advice was clear: leave as soon as they could. But the father resisted, refusing to abandon their home, convinced it would follow them no matter where they went. The priest left reluctantly, promising to keep them in his prayers, but the moment he stepped out, the house seemed to sink into a darkness deeper than before, as if punishing the family for bringing someone else inside. That night, the torment escalated to a level none of them had ever experienced. The whispers were constant, overlapping voices that came from every direction, filling the house with a chorus of threats and cries. The children screamed as objects flew from shelves, books hurling across the room and slamming against walls. The mother tried to gather them into the living room, but the furniture shifted on its own, blocking their way as though hurting them where the entity wanted them. The father shouted into the darkness, swinging his bat wildly at nothing, as though he could beat the unseen into submission. The voices rose higher, until the sound of a single deep growl drowned them all out, vibrating through the walls and shaking the family to their core. The daughter collapsed to the floor, clutching her head and crying out that it was inside her mind, whispering to her, telling her that she belonged to it. The son tried to pull her up, but he too screamed, insisting something had grabbed his arm, yanking him with a strength he couldn't fight. The mother fell to her knees sobbing prayers, while the father dragged both children away, determined to get them upstairs where at least the rooms had locks. But the stairs groaned beneath them, each step trembling as though the house itself was trying to throw them off balance. When they finally reached the top, they slammed the bedroom door shut, barricading it with whatever they could find. Inside the room, the atmosphere was suffocating. The lights flickered uncontrollably, plunging them in and out of darkness, until at last the bulb shattered above them, leaving only the pale glow of the moon through the window. In that faint light they all saw it, standing outside the door, its shadow bleeding under the crack and spilling across the floor. The shape was massive, its outline warped, its arms long enough to stretch halfway into the room. It didn't knock or rattle the door this time. It simply stood there, as though waiting, its presence seeping into their bones. The children cried into their mother's chest, the father holding the bat so tightly his knuckles turned white, but none of them dared to move. The house was no longer just haunted. It was alive, and it wanted them to understand that escape was not an option. The 9th chapter of their nightmare unfolded in an atmosphere where fear had hardened into despair, where even the smallest sounds of the house sent shivers down their spines. The entity was no longer hiding in the shadows or lurking at the edges of their vision. It was making itself known in every hour of the day. The children refused to sleep alone, their nights filled with screams and restless thrashing, as though they were being attacked in their dreams. The mother stayed awake most nights, rocking them and whispering comfort she didn't believe herself, her own body trembling with exhaustion. The father grew distant and unstable, pacing the house with bloodshot eyes, muttering to himself, as if caught in conversation with something only he could hear. The closer he looked into the history of the house, the more he became convinced that it wasn't simply haunted. It was claimed, bound by something that refused to let go of the lives within it. The disturbances now carried a violent edge that left no corner untouched. The family would wake to find furniture overturned, dishes smashed, and scratches etched into the walls that had not been there before. The scratches grew into shapes, symbols carved deep into the plaster, crude markings that no one in the family recognized, but which radiated menace. The son confessed one morning that he had seen the shadowy figure crouching by his bed while he slept, its long hands scraping the marks into the wall before vanishing into the darkness. The mother clutched him in terror, realizing these symbols were not random. They were invitations, gateways, a sign that the house itself was preparing for something far worse. The air inside the home became suffocating, thick with the smell of rot that no amount of cleaning could erase. Cold spots spread through the rooms, patches of air so frigid they left their skin tingling with frostbite when they passed through them. The family stopped using the basement entirely after the father went down one evening and swore he saw dozens of pale faces staring back at him from the shadows, faces twisted with rage and suffering, their mouths opening in silent screams. He bolted upstairs, drenched in sweat, unable to put into words the horror he had seen, but his silence said more than words ever could. The entity's grip tightened as if feeding on their weakness. The daughter grew ill, her once bright eyes dimming as she spent her days in bed, whispering about voices that called to her. She said they promised her peace if she would only come with them, their tone gentle but laced with malice. Her mother wept at her bedside, torn between holding on to her daughter and knowing something was trying to pull her away. The son, once fiery and defiant, became hollow and silent, sitting for hours at a time staring into empty corners, as though waiting for something to emerge. The father's defiance eroded completely after he awoke one night to find himself standing in the hallway with no memory of leaving his bed. In his hand was a knife from the kitchen, his knuckles white around the handle, his body trembling as though he had been guided there by another force. His wife found him and pulled the knife away, but the look in his eyes chilled her to her soul. He admitted in a shaking voice that he hadn't gone there on his own, that something had moved him like a puppet. From that moment on, the family no longer trusted even themselves, afraid that at any moment one of them might become the vessel of whatever ruled the house. Nights turned into battles for survival. They locked doors and pushed furniture against them, but the entity seeped through walls, through cracks, through their very thoughts. It no longer needed to frighten them. It owned them, body and mind, every whispered threat now a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The house groaned as though it was alive, its walls pulsing with energy, and the family felt it circling closer. Like a predator savoring the final moments before the kill, by the time the 10th chapter began, the family was stretched to the breaking point. Every night had become a waking nightmare. Every day a haze of fear and exhaustion. The house had revealed its hunger, and they were no longer residents. It was clear they were prisoners. The father, who had once sworn never to abandon the home, finally admitted what his wife and children had long known: if they stayed, they would not survive. With their belongings scattered and broken, with the walls etched in marks of things they did not understand, leaving with nothing suddenly seemed better than staying with everything. The decision to flee was made in the dead of night. They moved quickly, shoving clothes into bags, not bothering with the valuables, their only thought to escape before the house realized what they were doing. The atmosphere grew tense, heavy, as if the walls themselves were watching. Doors slammed upstairs even though no one was there. The whispers returned, but they weren't distant anymore. They were in their ears, calling each of their names with chilling precision. The children clung to their mother as the father ordered them out to the car, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. Just as they reached the front door, the lights in the house all flickered and died, plunging them into suffocating darkness. The air turned icy, their breaths visible in the black void. And then it appeared. The figure they had seen in shadows, in reflections, in nightmares now stood fully before them, blocking the exit. It was taller than the doorway, its faceless head tilting unnaturally, its arms outstretched as though inviting them back into its embrace. The father shouted at it, his voice breaking, demanding it let them go. But the house shuddered violently. Objects flew through the air, and the figure began to advance, its shape bending and twisting like smoke ready to consume them. In desperation, the mother clutched the rosary she had held onto since the first blessing and cried out in prayer. The children screamed, the father tried to shield them, and for a brief, agonizing moment, the figure loomed so close its presence pressed against their skin. Then, as if recoiling from the strength of their combined will, the apparition let out a deafening shriek that rattled every window in the house before dissolving into nothingness. The silence that followed was overwhelming, broken only by the family's sobs and the pounding of their hearts. They didn't wait to see if it would return. They bolted through the doorway, stumbling into the night, the cold air outside feeling like the first breath after drowning. The father started the car with trembling hands, the headlights cutting through the darkness as they drove away, never once looking back at the house that had nearly destroyed them. Behind them, the windows of the home flickered faintly, as if eyes were watching their departure. But they didn't slow down. They drove until exhaustion forced them to stop, but one thing was certain: they would never return. The house still stood silent and waiting, ready for the next unsuspecting family, who might see only charm in its old walls and not the darkness festering within. For those who survived, it was no longer their home, but a memory they would never escape. The family carried scars no one could see, but they carried them nonetheless, proof that sometimes the worst monsters are not in forests or graveyards, but within the very walls meant to keep us safe. And to my audience, thank you for staying with me through this terrifying journey. These stories remind us that not every dream home is what it seems, and sometimes the past refuses to let go of the present. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, make sure to stay tuned for more disturbing true horror stories. Your support means everything, and together, we'll continue to explore the shadows that most people are too afraid to face.